unfortunately do, you know, have invasive species that come from the US into other countries as well. But invasive species are a real economic and ecological concern. Again, this lack of natural enemies for insects specifically allows these populations to grow exponentially. You know, we've heard a lot about exponential growth in the last 6 months. And so insects will do the same thing without their natural enemies, where we get exponential growth, and you know, our management strategies try and dampen the impact that they have. So can you go to the next slide now? So spotted lanternfly is one of our more gregarious and obvious invasive species of late in terms of insects. It is beautifully colored. It is not a moth. Most people see this picture that it's been touted by the Department of Agriculture with its wings spread, and you can see these bright red warning colorations on its hind wings. But more often when you see it, those wings are folded over. And it is what we call a plant hopper, which is in the Fulgorid family. And it is related to other true bugs, as I have shown here on the right of your screen. On the top is another lanternfly, which maybe you can see why they are considered to be, they're called lanternflies because they have this enlarged area at the top of their head, and it's thought to glow in some cultures. They're also related to leafhoppers and other tree hoppers, as well as aphids and cicadas. So they have these plucking mouth parts that can look like a very sharp needle, but they cannot bite humans or animals. Next slide. So the general life cycle of spotted lanternfly is not actually that complex. Right now we are in the kind of in the middle between our adults, and we are just starting to see egg laying. So the adults will lay eggs starting around now through the first frost, when the adults are generally killed off. And the life stage that spends the winter is the egg stage. The females lay these egg masses, which look like a big splotch of mud, on pretty much any flat surface or flat-ish surface. There's about 30 to 50 eggs in a mass, and they're covered in a waxy surface. Fortunately, this makes it look a lot like a big splotch of mud. And so it can be difficult to distinguish between a spotted lanternfly egg mass and other biological material sometimes. The waxy layer helps protect the eggs from freezing, and they can survive freezing weather. If you just pop the egg masses in the freezer and then bring them out, they will likely still hatch. And then we see a hatch into one of the first of the 4 instars, and the instar is also another name for a nymph. So this is the immature stage or the young stage. They go into this first instar. We saw a hatch in New Jersey in mid-May of this year. And then they go through, they're black with white polka dots, and they are black with white polka dots for the first, second, and third instars. They can jump in these stages as well. And especially during the first instar, they will be clustered on plants. So they will be kind of congregated in larger numbers on those host plants. In the 4th and final instar before the adult stage, they will turn brightly colored, they're brightly colored markings. And it's thought that they are accumulating plant toxins during the nymphal instars, and then they are showing it as a warning coloration during that 4th and final instar. And so they have been shown to be distasteful to many bird species. They're not poisonous to humans, but they are probably very distasteful to most animal species. That 4th instar, again, is not a flying stage. They will hop and walk, and they will then molt to the adult stage beginning the end of July, early August. Now, there's considerable overlap in all of these life stages. So we've seen first instars at the same time we've seen third instars in the field. And that's just because depending on where the egg is laid, if it's in a more protected area, it may not experience the environmental conditions needed for egg hatch as fast as some of the other ones. So we get a lot of overlap, and there's a bit of a delay. Now, fortunately for us, there is a delay between the time that the adults become adults and the time they become reproductively mature. That's at least about 6 weeks. So the adults that we were seeing up in northern New Jersey, where we have our most significant populations, were adults in early August, and they just started mating last week. we expect to see egg laying if it hasn't already happened in the next week or so. And these adults will lay eggs until the frost occurs, hard frost. On the right is a picture of a few spotted lanternflies on a grapevine in a commercial vineyard. Next slide. So the egg mass, so right now we have two main life stages. Those are the adults, which are brightly colored, although surprisingly camouflaged. When their wings are folded, that gray polka dot coloration can actually make it a little difficult to see on the bark of a tree. I had taken my son out to help me sample during the summer, and he remarked that they were climbing up a black walnut tree, and he remarked that they were a lot harder to see than he had expected them to be for being so brightly colored. And this is a kid who sees bugs all the time because, especially during COVID, they live at my house. So this is the egg mass stage here. I don't think you guys can see my cursor, but there's actually two egg masses in this picture. The first is a freshly laid egg mass, and that's the one that's gray and a little bit shiny. The one behind it hatched in the previous year. And we often see this with overlapping egg masses laid on the same bark surface. So those are the types of life stages that we would be seeing right now. And egg masses are very concerning because they're easily transported to non-quarantine areas. They will lay them on paving stones, they'll lay them on lawn furniture, they'll lay them on playground equipment, telephone poles, Christmas trees, pretty much any type of inert material that we have. So they only have one generation per year though, which is a really big benefit. Next slide. So the instars, or the nymphs, again, they go through 4 nymphal instar stages. They're black with the white polka dots, and they will jump, and they develop these red patches. They can climb pretty fast, and we believe that they climb up the same trees or up new trees almost every single day, because while they can cling on to the trees, they're easily disturbed. And so we've used this kind of climbing behavior as a monitoring method, as well as, I don't want to call it a management method, but the general public is using it as a management tool by wrapping these sticky bands around tree trunks to try and intercept the bugs as they crawl up. So in this picture here, we have a yellow band that is covered with spotted lanternfly nymphs. And if you look at the direction of it, you can see that most of these nymphs are coming from the bottom of the sticky band and climbing up. The ones that are on top probably just crawled over their little brothers and sisters' backs to get to the top of the sticky band. And so they can climb about 16 feet in 15-minute span. So they can climb pretty fast as well. Now nymphs we often say that they will eat everything, as was said earlier. This is true and it's not. They have a narrower host range than, say, brown marmorated stink bug, which has over 170 different host plants. Spotted lanternfly has a host range of 70 host plants, and that's wide during the nymphal stages, and it narrows as they become adults. We do seem to find them on more distasteful or toxic plants. We found them on milkweed. We find them on cucumber pretty frequently. At tree of heaven, which is a major host plant, has a lot of plant defensive compounds that make it distasteful. Black walnut is another one. So they tend to feed on these plants that aren't very tasteful to us or to predator species. And in fact, my student has been doing some studies where we've been caging nymphs on different host plants, and they don't survive well on host plants that are not defended, like red maple, which is a really popular host plant for the adult stages. Those nymphs they don't do well. They don't survive well on the red maple, whereas they survive really well on black walnut and tree of heaven. Next slide. Caitlin, can you advance the slide? There you go. Okay, so our problem with spotted lanternfly has multiple layers with this. So spotted lanternfly is our main problem up here at the top, and we have 2 main stakeholders. We have you, the general public, as well as our agricultural stakeholders. The stakeholders there are farmers primarily. The impact to them is different as well. To our agricultural industry, our farmers and our growers, they have immediate economic losses. And this can come in the sense of increased pesticide use, crop losses, as well as the approach to kind of sustain this, help dampen this agricultural impact is being performed by the New Jersey Department of Agriculture with their quarantine efforts. Now, to the general public, the impact is a little different. Obviously, I think many of you are concerned about the impact to agriculture and the environment, but the immediate concern is the amount of honeydew that is produced by these bugs, as well as the nuisance of having these bugs in your property. This has led to a couple different approaches, primarily a squash and scrape approach, where you squash the adults or the nymphs and you scrape the egg masses off of the trees. This is a very time-consuming task, and if you really are interested in it, there's plenty of social media groups on Spotted Lanternfly that provide a good bit of humor in terms of squashing methods. If you can go to the next slide. So I mentioned that the honeydew is a big problem. The lanternfly, during all of its life stages, are phloem feeders. So they have a very strong proboscis or piercing sucking mouth part that they can insert into the plant tissue through the bark of a tree, and they feed on the sugar, the plant phloem or the sugar sap. Unfortunately, this is not a very nutritious host food source for insects, and so they have to feed lots and lots and lots and lots on this phloem. And what happens is they then excrete all the extra sugary substance, which is what we call honeydew. Now, aphids do the same type of thing. If you notice, if you have aphids or scales on a house plant or a plant in your garden, you will get a lot of sticky underneath those underneath the plant. That's what we call honeydew, and it's just excess sugar that's excreted. Now, when this happens, it can turn black with sooty mold. So in this picture here, we have an adult, that's adult female, that is feeding on, well, she's not feeding right this second, but she's on a branch that's black. That is not, is black with sooty mold. So that whole plant was just covered in honeydew, and it sooty mold grew as a result of that. Next slide. And this honeydew and sooty mold growth can cover the ground underneath trees that are infested with spotted lanternfly. Oftentimes what we're seeing, especially lower areas where there's lower populations, like in South Jersey, you can see one or two spotted lanternflies, but if you look up at the tops of the trees and the canopy will be almost black with sooty mold, as well as many of the plants underneath, whether it's raspberry, poison ivy, or just spice bush. Any understory plant becomes black with this sooty mold and honeydew mixture, and it can create, it can really lead to the decline of those plants. Next slide. Now, this honeydew can also cover patio equipment. It can cover playground equipment, so it becomes a really big nuisance problem to the homeowners. It will also create these fungal mats. So these are some tree of heaven trees here where you can probably, if you look closely, you can see spotted lanternfly on, not on the sticky cards, but on the right above and below those sticky bands on those trees. And all that black material underneath is sooty mold and a fungal mat that's been growing from all the feeding up in the tree canopy. This can also attract ants and yellow jackets and bees. So, and it doesn't smell too pleasant. Next slide. All right, can you click on this video? Yep. So when we talk about spotted lanternfly being a problem, this is what we're really talking about. And I apologize for the quality of the video, but the shock value is pretty good. This is a tree in Pennsylvania that's just coated with spotted lanternfly, and the homeowner went up to it and just started brushing the spotted lanternfly off the trees. At some point in some populations, that is how many spotted lanternfly are present on a single property. Now, they will have this congregation behavior where they congregate on single trees. And from a management perspective and even an eradication perspective, that's a really useful behavior that we can exploit for their management. Next slide. Now, spotted lanternfly has kind of captured the public's interest and possibly fear more than most recent insect invaders. So, Gary Larson wasn't drawing here about spotted lanternfly, but the idea of I'm not going to panic, there's spotted lanternfly in my yard, but I'm not going to panic is something we really need to keep in mind. While we need to balance managing spotted lanternfly, we really don't want to incite a panic among homeowners. There's plenty of videos going around of, kids stomping on spotted lanternfly and, killing them with fly swatters. But, and then there's other kind of visual graphics that are going around saying only you can stop this invader. So I think that, is a little exaggerated in the sense that, we have concerted efforts by researchers at universities, and we also have coordinated efforts with our local Department of Agriculture that are really working on more of a broad scale to manage this pest. But if you have it in your yard and in your garden, then certainly, there are management recommendations that you can use to help us in this fight against this invasive species. Next slide. So, but because of this kind of capturing the public's attention, we've been able to use citizen science reporting to help us track and determine where spotted lanternfly is in the Northeast Mid-Atlantic region. So this is a map that's produced by the New York State IPM Center, and all the blue areas surrounded with red are the areas that are currently under quarantine for spotted lanternfly. If they're just blue, it just means that there's spotted lanternfly present in those areas. Not every state has established a quarantine. If we zoom in to New Jersey, we can see that we have an 8-county quarantine area in the state that was established. Initially, it was 3 counties in 2018. It is expanded to 8 counties, all of those pretty much bordering Pennsylvania, and expanded to those in 2019. They have not expanded the quarantine this year, although we do know we have a lot of new reports, including Cape May County. We're getting reports in Union County now, probably due to the Staten Island find. We get reports in spotted lanternfly has been reported by homeowners in every single county in New Jersey now. It's just whether or not the state is calling that a infestation or not, and they have their own regulations for doing so. Next slide. There's been a lot of research using different climate matching models to predict where spotted lanternfly will establish in the United States. And here's an example of one that shows a pretty widespread distribution of spotted lanternfly in the US. The areas that are red are the ones where spotted lanternfly is most likely to establish and thrive, whereas the ones that are white are unsuitable. Now, this may be linked to suitable host habitat as well as other landscape factors. So it may not do as well, let's say in the Midwest as predicted. Now there's another model out there as well that predicts a very limited distribution that's not that much bigger than what it currently is. So there's a lot of varying factors out there. One important thing about spotted lanternfly is, and this is typical with a lot of invasive species, is that we don't know very much about it in its country of origin, which is China. It is invasive in Korea, and so we have a little bit more information that comes out of Korea, but because invasive species to us usually have predators and the natural ecosystem balance in their country of origin, they're not as big of a pest, and therefore they're not studied as much in their country of origin. So we're usually starting at a pretty low level of knowledge when we're starting off with these invasive species. Now, spotted lanternfly first invaded into Pennsylvania in 2014. It was invaded in New Jersey in 2018, or at least that's when it was detected. So we're really very early on in the infestation. If you compare that to something like brown marmorated stink bug, which invaded in 1996, we didn't have that population outbreak until 2010. And we were working on it starting in 2003. So there's a big, we're kind of ahead of the game in a lot of senses for spotted lanternfly in terms of our research, and we can learn we can utilize what's been learned by Penn State, and we're working very closely with Penn State researchers for coordinated research projects as well. Next slide. So what we've been doing in New Jersey is, I mentioned already, the New Jersey Department of Agriculture has established a quarantine, and the quarantine basically tries to limit, it doesn't limit, it requires a self-inspection of your vehicles and materials that you're moving when you move in and out of the quarantine zone. Now, New Jersey Department of Agriculture has been tracking the insect. They've moved to just tracking it on the farms. And we've been doing through Rutgers and our New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, we've been putting out fact sheets and bulletins for our grower community And our county agents are also recording all calls as well. Can you advance? But one thing that we did when we first had the infestation of brown marmorated stink bug is we started a reporting email system, and that worked really, really well for brown marmorated stink bug because they go into houses, and so they cause that homeowner nuisance. And so we built upon the system that we created for brown marmorated stink bug, and we applied it to spotted lanternfly. And so we have a reporting website, reporting email, which is slanternfly@njaes.rutgers.edu. That allows the general public to submit a photo with their address or township, and that will help us track this insect as it moves. We're also tracking it with a phenology study using different traps. We're using eDNA, and we're looking at management in wine grapes as well. Next slide. So our reporting method, now our reports are not robust. It's the Department of Agriculture, but it gives us a good idea of where the bug is located in terms of, and it kind of just depends on who reports it, whereas how they find out about the web reporting email. So if you can see these little red dots here on our state map, you can see that in 2018, our reports were primarily in Hunterdon, Warren, and Mercer County. Next slide. Oh, okay. So in 2019, you can see that the population increased. You can go ahead. It's all right. In 2020, our reports have really skyrocketed. I think back in July, comparing 2020 July to 2019 July, we saw a 1,300% increase in the number of reports that we were getting. Now that's only for the nymphal stages that are present, which aren't as apparent in the landscape as the adults. So the general public is very knowledgeable that this is a problem, and they're reporting it, and that's really good. And we like having this information so that we can kind of track its spread. Now, people were also home a bit more in 2020, so maybe that contributed to more increased reports, but based off of what we're seeing in traps throughout the state, as well as on our commercial farms, I think this population increase that we've seen is very valid. Next slide. I want to point out, though, that those are only our confirmed reports. So how does spotted lanternflies survive so well? The egg masses I've mentioned already are very easily transported because they're hard to detect. We do see kind of a relationship with egg masses being laid along railroad lines, and because the adults are just flying off of that. There's few natural enemies, and they're distasteful to birds. Now, I mentioned earlier when we were just chatting that they're not very strong flyers, but they are good hitchhikers. And if you look closely at this photo of this red-tailed hawk, you can see on the bottom left leg that a spotted lanternfly had crawled up that post and is now on the hawk's leg. Go to the next slide. And as that hawk took off, so did the spotted lanternfly. So they have other means of transport than just kind of drifting along the air currents and getting passed along with the egg masses. We have estimated that we see a spread of about 17 kilometers a year in our current area. They also have this wide host range, as I mentioned earlier, and that does help, our generalist plant feeders. Having a wide host range does help them survive because they can choose multiple hosts to survive on. Next slide. So they have a list of preferred host plants, and then they also have a list of host plants that they can complete development on. Tree of Heaven is a preferred host plant. Now, this is also an invasive species, and you can see it very readily along disturbed areas. It grows in clumps along highways, for instance. Black walnut, which is a native species, is another preferred host plant. Both wild and cultivated grape are host plants, and red maple, river birch, willow, and sycamore are really important host plants as well. Now, we do know that Tree of Heaven, black walnut, chinaberry, tulip poplar, sawtooth oak, hops, bittersweet, and butternut can support complete development of spotted lanternfly. So not all of these host plants, for instance, red maple cannot support development throughout its entire life cycle. So they have to move between different host plants. But these other host plants on the right can support development. And that's really important from a management perspective as well. Next slide. So here's a couple pictures from, I don't know, last month, I think, in North Jersey. Here is Tree of Heaven, and you can see this plant had thousands on them, but on the leaf, they were just kind of every single growing shoot on that Tree of Heaven had spotted lanternfly adults feeding on it. And the picture on the right is a sycamore tree that my student took last week in North Jersey, and you can see that it is coated, and there are thousands of spotted lanternflies on that tree. So we definitely have high populations in New Jersey. We have breeding populations in New Jersey, and they are at the levels that we need to initiate management in many areas. Next slide. So when we monitor in the first steps of an invasive species for an insect, one of the things that we first try and figure out is its life cycle, its seasonality. When do the eggs hatch? When do the nymphs show up? And how do we monitor for it so that we can then initiate management tactics? So we monitor the egg hatches by just finding the egg masses out in the landscape and monitoring them. We've done separate studies in the laboratory where we've been able to determine the temperature and the number of degree days required for egg hatch. But it's a pretty, I think the minimum temperature threshold is 7 degrees Celsius to hatch. We use sticky traps, as I showed you earlier. These are problematic though. As you can see here, my summer intern last year was using sticky traps. You can see an adult right above it. And on these sticky traps, we get a lot of non-target species, which make just counting the bugs hard, but we also get a lot of non-targets that we don't want, like birds. And there's been reports of bats as well as lizards and things like that. So the current recommendation for homeowners, if they're using these sticky cards, is to put chicken wire or some sort of mesh over top of it. So that the lanternflies can get caught, but that our non-target species, especially our bird friends, don't get targeted. Sorry, and caught by these sticky cards. So now we have a trap that encompasses it's a mesh trap. It encompasses the tree trunk with a collection chamber on top, and as the bugs are crawling up the trap, it intercepts their movement. However, there is no lure or attractant for spotted lanternfly, and this is kind of a big misconception. I think a lot of times when the public thinks of an attractant for an insect, they think of something like Japanese beetle, which is an aggregation pheromone plus a host plant volatile, and it attracts them in mass. And that's sometimes what we want to use, and it's most of the time not what we actually use. But there is no lure for spotted lanternfly, so none of these traps that we're using are attracting spotted lanternfly more than they are any other insect that's crawling up these trees. There is some research that's going on to try and identify species-specific attractants, but there are no plant hoppers that have any sort of pheromone that's known as of right now. Again, because they're a pretty understudied group in general. We do know, using this kind of technique though, that they will follow host plant senescence. So they prefer these plants with really high sugars, and they also prefer host plants that are chemically defended. We see them on grape, we see them on ailanthus or tree of heaven throughout the growing season, but we see them on grape in June. They do seem to prefer black walnut in July, going into August. And then the populations will increase on Tree of Heaven in September, late August and early September. And they will be in grape. We need to update this. This is from last year, but they will be on grape for most of the summer. But with the most populations in June, when those egg masses are hatching, the nymphs will kind of feed for a little bit and then leave a vineyard. But then they'll come back in large numbers in September and October. And we've been seeing them in vineyards in very large numbers since the end of August, early September. Next slide. So our primary risk here is spread to additional host plants. Spread to additional states. We are under quarantine in our state, and we also don't want it to be. You can go ahead and play that video. And we want to prevent spread to additional counties. Now, another concern, especially from both a homeowner concern as well as an agricultural concern, is this production of honeydew. This is a video taken by a student at Penn State, and you can't see it yet, but the top of this one bug next to on the top right hand of this one grape cluster, it'll start shooting out honeydew, and you can also see it kind of glinting off on the top left corner. Can you see it in this video? Good earlier. But as they're feeding, there's some coming out now. As they're feeding, they're shooting out this honeydew, and then that creates that sooty mold, which is a concern. From an agricultural perspective, though, our primary concern is that this feeding, we believe, blocks the flow of phloem as the plants are senescing, and so it impairs the plant's ability to store sugars for the winter, and it causes vine death in grapevines. Next slide. So we have seen in Pennsylvania a couple of different vineyards that have 100% loss, and it's attributed to spotted lanternfly feeding. I think that there's a lot of others going on, but we do know that feeding by spotted lanternfly during those September months will decrease the ability of the plant to overwinter by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so in these winters where we've had a couple of these, and you'll probably hear about them next week when Dr. Robinson speaks, but when we have these really harsh winters or warm winters that then have a couple really hard freezes, sorry, that can prevent the plant from being able to survive the winter. And so then the grower can experience complete crop loss in the following year. We have not seen that yet to occur in New Jersey, but we do have a couple of vineyards that have thousands of them in a single, within, basically they have over 100 per vine. So, they're under very high pressure in some areas of northern New Jersey. Next slide. So you can hit it again. So while spotted lanternfly can be multiple crops like soybean, even cucumbers, even some apples and peaches, to date we don't have any spotted lanternfly that are reported have caused economic injury in any agricultural commodity other than grapes. So our focus right now from a research and management perspective is on the wine grape industry and protecting them. Next slide. Okay, so we've been trying to monitor spotted lanternfly through the sticky cards, as well as the circle traps and just visual counts and the general public. And those are great, but usually there's kind of an error there, right? You have to know where they are. You have to know what you're looking for, and you usually don't see the insects in large numbers until they're at large numbers. So we've been deploying another type of method, which is eDNA, and I think some of you are familiar with this already. eDNA is environmental DNA. It's essentially the little bits that are left behind when an insect feeds on a plant or molts in the area. And luckily, since spotted lanternfly feeds on this phloem, and they're producing all this extra phloem, we can actually pick that up from a host plant using either the spray method in the middle or using a roller aggregation, where we literally take a wet paint roller and roll it on a host plant to pick up any honeydew that's there. We then use a very specific segment of DNA and run it through a qPCR, which is a very sensitive technique for analyzing DNA segments. And then we can determine whether or not we have a positive hit for spotted lanternfly or a negative hit. So go to the next slide, please. So what we did last year, and remember, spotted lanternfly had only been present in New Jersey for one growing season that we knew about. We did a survey with eDNA at 12 participating vineyards in the state, all represented by these pins. And what we could see, we did 2 different rounds, one in September and one in October. And there's a couple sites up north where we knew that we had spotted lanternfly, and a bunch of other sites where we had never detected spotted lanternfly. So what we found is that the eDNA is about 25% more sensitive than our visual samples. So we're 4 times more likely to find a spotted lanternfly with the eDNA than we are with the visual samples. And so we detected spotted lanternfly at, I think, 12 of these farms with eDNA, where we only collected them with visual surveys 6 times. And that was even a starker difference in the early part of the season when we detected it at 7 farms, and only 1 of those we had a positive result with. So we know that this eDNA technique we can use as a biosurveillance tool to kind of detect the population before it's there, and that allows our growers to be better prepared the next year and know where to look in their vineyard. Next slide. Okay, so management, I'm going to stop here for 1 second and see if anybody has any questions before we go into the management part. I'm not seeing any in the chat or the question and answer, but I just wanted to take a break and ask.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So if anyone does have a question for Anne so far, you can place it in the chat. That video in the beginning, Anne, was like, I'm glad I took my video off, because the face I was making when the guy put his hand on the tree and they all just fell off was pretty gross.
Yeah, they are unpleasant. They smell pretty bad too once they're dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a good shock value. Like, this is why we care about this bug. So one.
I have a question real fast, I guess.
Yeah.
So I mean, I know I saw wine, like grape vineyards, and it looked like hops as well could be at risk for, I think you said, in like the later stages.
Mm-hmm.
So I know in New Jersey right now, a lot of things that are popping up are wineries, breweries. Are they doing anything in advance to kind of protect their business, protect their crops right now? Because it is, a huge economic loss. I know a lot of people are buying local, getting people food and drink and all of that. So do you know what's going on right now in terms of that?
Yes. So the hops part, we're still trying to figure out. So initial reports out of Pennsylvania were saying that they were feeding on hop plants, and I think definitely causing sooty mold in the hops. We have not yet seen that in New Jersey, and we have a research farm that's pretty much in the heart of hop of spotted lanternfly infestation, and there's hops being grown there. We're not seeing that yet. So I think whether or not hops are an important host plant or at risk is still really up in the air. In terms of our vineyards and our wineries, we have been doing extension talks to them, to those stakeholders for the past couple of years, 3 years, I think. I think my first talk was in 2016 to the wine, grape, and nursery industry in New Jersey. So they are very well aware of this pest. However, they can't technically by the label spray for spotted lanternfly until they have it. So, but the one part, this is kind of a double-edged sword here. One thing is that there's a lot of different insecticides that kill spotted lanternfly, and a lot of those are currently labeled for grapes, and they're currently used by our wine grape growers for other pests. So if they're spraying for Japanese beetle, for instance, in the midsummer, if they use almost every material that they would be using to control Japanese beetle in their normal production practices are going to kill any spotted lanternfly nymphs that are present in the vineyard at that time. What our grape growers don't normally do, however, is spray for any insect pests close to harvest, nor after
Mm.
harvest. And that big movement to grapes that occurs in mid-September, or sorry, early September, it happened a little earlier this year. That is making our growers have to spray every 5 to 7 days in the areas that they are where we have infestations, and that's not something that they're used to. It's a big economic loss for them. So they're trying to, figure out how to save their vines and still have an economic, come out in above, not red, right?
Right.
The other growers that don't have the population or the pest yet, they're just being vigilant. They're, inspecting anything before it comes into the vineyard to prevent a population from starting. They are, and they know what it looks like. The adults are about 1 inch long, by the way. I see Rhonda's question there. So they're pretty obvious to see. And these growers, they're smart. They know what they're looking for. They're out there. They've informed all of their workers as to what to look for and to be on the lookout. So, they're looking is, I think, the best way that they can use to protect their vineyards right now.
Gotcha.
So there's a question on whether or not it's dangerous to trap all caterpillars and other beneficial insects with sticky tapes. That was a problem with gypsy moth. In that case, though, you were trying to trap the caterpillars. So we're not getting a lot of caterpillars on these trees. There's a difference between the host plants that gypsy moth uses, which tend towards the oaks, versus spotted lanternfly. So we're not seeing a lot of caterpillars, and we're getting some beneficial insects. Sorry, I have a little thing in my throat here. It is a problem though, and that's why we're trying to create a lure or an attractant, and we're trying to use trapping methods like our circle trap that is not a sticky tape. But when we first had this bug, there's no other method to control them or to monitor them. We kind of went through what have we done for other invasive species? We use sticky tape for gypsy moth. So we kind of go back to what we know has worked in the past. But we're conscious now of all the other players and all of our beneficial insects in the system. So the next question is about Tree of Heaven, and I'm going to get to that in a couple slides. But if you have any more questions on that, Steve, we can talk about it at the end too. So if I didn't answer those questions. Okay, so managing spotted lanternfly is, I would say it's essential. So we're still at the very early stages of our infestation, and the state is still in eradication mode. So we want to stop this invasive species, not only to protect our homeowners from this nuisance and our native trees like black walnut and red maple, but also just to kind of protect our agricultural industry. We are the garden state. We have a really important agricultural industry here, and we need to protect our farmers' livelihoods. And the more we can do to control spotted lanternfly, the less environmental impact we can have later on. So when we talk about management from an insect perspective, we're kind of talking about a lot of different steps here. We first talk about containment for an invasive species, which includes quarantine or self-inspection. Next step is physical control. And for spotted lanternfly, that includes physical removal and host plant removal, hence the Tree of Heaven. The next part is biological control with both exotic and endemic or native species. And then finally, pesticides. Now, unfortunately, we kind of tend to jump immediately to pesticides, and sometimes with an invasive species, that's necessary. And we do have pesticides that are effective against spotted lanternfly. Next slide. Okay, so physical control for spotted lanternfly includes basically two things. One is egg scraping. Now, egg scraping is what was first recommended by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and it's been recommended by the New Jersey Department of Agriculture. And that's great. Any egg mass you see is going to contain 30 to 50 eggs. If you can remove that, you have to actually dunk it into hand sanitizer or alcohol to kill it. And you'll have a tiny little impact on the population. However, one thing to keep in mind is you are, maybe you can go up to 6, 7 feet tall. Most of the spotted lanternfly are laying eggs in the very tops of those trees, and you're not going to get to them. So, and a lot of spotted lanternfly, such as shown in this picture, this is a picture taken from the woods behind a vineyard in New Jersey where spotted lanternfly had just been detected that year. There are probably about 10 different egg masses or more in these two pictures each. These are all on the underside of dead peeling bark. So those females will find a way to hide, to lay their eggs in any protected space possible. Luckily, my lab's been pretty good at finding these things, but if you have dead peeling bark, I'd peel it back and look for spotted lanternfly eggs and just throw the whole thing in the fire. So removing egg masses will help, but it's a drop in the bucket. Next slide. Another tactic homeowners are using are the sticky bands. Again, make sure you protect them with some sort of mesh that's not shown in this picture. And you can make them out of duct tape that you reverse. You can buy sticky tape for trees at home improvement stores. There's a lot of different innovations you can use. Some people are 3D printing traps that are more like the circle trap that we use. But the sticky bands will, they'll remove a few thousand bugs from the trees as they move up and down. On the right is not what I would recommend. I would not recommend climbing up on a pool ladder and trying to kill spotted lanternfly with a homemade solution with a spray bottle. I think you're at more risk to harm yourself than you are to kill the spotted lanternfly. There are reports of people going to the hospital because they climbed up on ladders and fell trying to kill lanternflies. Now, homeowners and the public are coming up with all sorts of really great solutions, lots of soapy water and alcohol mixtures, and they're spraying them up into the trees with, modified hoses and backpack sprayers. The more we can kill, the better, but you have to do it in a safe method. And I would not recommend what the gentleman in the right is doing. Also using a spray bottle is probably not going to get very good coverage. And again, they're at the tops of those trees. And you can, there are hundreds probably in the tops of the trees that you're not going to get with a spray bottle. Next slide. So there's also some estimates that all these squashing campaigns and fly swatters, although this Lanternfly kills scoreboard that I pulled off of Facebook is really impressive in terms of how many this family or community killed. It's a family bonding activity perhaps, but there's some estimates that this is only probably having an impact on about 1% of the spotted lanternfly population, both the squatting and the trapping and the egg scraping. So we really need to make sure, we need to find other solutions to this as well. Next slide. So this goes to the question about tree of heaven. Now, tree of heaven is a primary host plant of spotted lanternfly. They do not need it to complete development, but they do a lot better when they have access to feeding on it. So they develop faster and they survive better when they feed on tree of heaven. Now, tree of heaven is also an invasive species, so don't feel bad about killing it. It can be identified because it has compound leaves, and at the base of each of those leaves, they have 1 or 2 lobes or teeth at the base of each leaflet. It's a very smooth leaf margin, unlike sumac. Sumac has a serrated edge along the edge, along the leaf margin, sorry, and black walnut does not have those teeth at the base. So those are 2 ways to distinguish it from those other host plants, which are commonly found around tree of heaven. Now, tree of heaven also has a rotten peanut butter odor when crushed. I have a truck full of tree of heaven leaf samples in my vehicle right now, and it has a very distinctive, unpleasant odor. But these trees can get very large. They will also tend to grow in clusters, and only the females produce seeds. Next slide. Now, the bark of tree of heaven, this is the description that helped me the most, is that it looks like a cantaloupe rind. Maybe that doesn't work for you, but this is a picture in the top right corner of tree of heaven bark, and to me that does look like some cantaloupe rind, maybe differently colored, but it's distinct from like black walnut or sumac. And it does have these compound leaves here, and the females produce these big, huge clusters of samaras or seeds, with a single tree producing up to 3,000 different seeds. So it's really important to get rid of those female trees specifically. Now, management of tree of heaven is something that's been recommended by Pennsylvania and New Jersey State Department of Agriculture's. Now, this is information coming from the Penn State website, but our own weed scientists recommend the same thing. You want to do management after July 1st, and that's because at that time the tree starts condensing its carbohydrates and sending it to the roots. And so herbicides are more effective at that time because they're translocated down to the root tissue. They are not recommending to cut the stump and then spray an herbicide on it anymore. That was the initial recommendation, and they say that that just causes the new shoots to come up. And we see this time and time again, where tree of heaven has been cut down and applied herbicide, and then we just get shoots. And within a year, those shoots can be 3 feet tall, and covered in spotted lanternfly. So the two recommendations that are currently being made by Penn State are foliar treatment and a basal bark treatment. The foliar treatment is a glyphosate and trichlorpyr treatment to the foliage. The basal bark treatment is for trees that are less than 6 inches in diameter, and there you're also using trichlorpyr, and you spray it from the ground up to 18 inches. Now, usually these require more than one application a year, and maybe even a follow-up in the second year. The other method for a larger tree is a hack and squirt method, which from what I understand is where you make cuts along the bark tissue, but you have to make sure you leave branches in between that, and then you apply these your foliar or basal bark treatments, with the idea that it will help penetrate into the cambium tissue a little bit more. So that's the current recommendation, and there's videos on how to do this available through the Penn State Extension Cooperative Extension website. If you Google Tree of Heaven in Penn State, the video is one of the first hits that will come up, and it shows you their recommendation for how to control Tree of Heaven after July 1st. So you'd have to wait a little bit if you want to do that for next year. Next slide. Now, in terms of the next stage of management is biological control, which is where another organism is feeding on another one, organism one is feeding on organism two. Now we see lots of our native natural enemies, our jumping spiders, our orb weaving spiders, praying mantids, assassin bugs. All of these will feed on spotted lanternfly. They are not going to feed on spotted lanternfly to the point that they will control or make a dent in the population. It's fun to watch. A praying mantid behead a spotted lanternfly, but this is, they're just doing their thing. They're not going to make a significant dent in the population in terms of biological control. These are all generalist predators, so they will feed on whatever the next insect comes available. Next slide. There is a lot of research right now going on specifically by USDA APHIS and USDA ARS looking for biological control agents in the form of other insects, specifically egg parasitoids and a few nymphal parasitoids. This is being done in two different ways. One, a group of researchers have gone to China, and in all of the places here shown in with the yellow little dot, they've collected parasitoids from spotted lanternfly eggs or nymphs and have brought them back and are currently looking at them under quarantine facilities. These, if these are successful and they go through a very rigorous screening process to make sure that they are species specific, they could be released in the future. Now, this takes years and years to happen. For instance, with brown marmorated stink bug, they still have not released the parasitoid. It got here on its own, but they haven't released the parasitoid yet. There has been some surveys where we've detected Enocertus, for instance, which is a tiny egg parasitoid, shown here with the arrow in the bottom picture. This is a parasitoid, so it's a tiny stingless wasp that lays its eggs inside of other eggs, another insect egg. This is actually a gypsy moth parasitoid that is a switching host to spotted lanternfly. So it's kind of encouraging. It was, released for gypsy moth and now is being found on spotted lanternfly. However, we're still at very, very low levels of these parasitoid populations. So this will take some time for those populations to build up to the point that they have an impact as well. Next slide. So we do have I've mentioned a couple times that we do have a lot of insecticides that are effective against spotted lanternfly. Now this is a table that we share with our growers. There are insecticides that are available for homeowners, such as Sevin or Carbaryl is available for homeowners, and that's a very effective material for killing spotted lanternfly. But most of our pyrethroids and our neonicotinoids are going to be effective against spotted lanternfly, and they have advantages and disadvantages. The pyrethroids are going to be effective at killing the bugs immediately, whereas the neonicotinoids are going to be taken up by the plants. And I know there's a lot of bad press about neonicotinoids right now with their bee toxicity. And there's some guidance about how to use those as well for spotted lanternfly. But for instance, if you had a black walnut tree or a tree of heaven in your yard, you can use a product called dinotefuran, and you can spray that. It's taken up by the tree, so it can get to the insecticide is carried up the tree to the top where the spotted lanternfly are, and it will not be present in the tree at the following spring when the bees would be foraging on the pollen. So there are good insecticides, not good insecticides, sorry, there are selective insecticides that you can use that have that will not have as much environmental toxicity. And you can also contract with local landscaping companies to do those pesticide applications. And that is actually what I would recommend to do. But we do have materials that our growers are able to use, and they're able to use them to control spotted lanternfly. Next slide. We also have identified a couple species of beneficial fungus, or what we call entomopathogenic fungi. On the left is Bavaria bassiana, and that is actually available as Botanigard commercially. It takes about 1 to 2 weeks to kill the bugs, and they turn into these white little cotton ball puffy looking things. And we've been looking at this as a management tool in grapes earlier in the season, and then Penn State's also looking at applying this to forest wood edges where there's really high levels of spotted lanternfly to control the nymphs with minimal impact to the surrounding beneficial insects. The other one is what we call Bacteria major, and it is one of these fungi that affects the behavior. You can see that we also call it like the white bearded one, and it causes the lanternfly to climb up to the, climb up and then attach itself to the tree so that then it will sporulate and rain down more fungal particles, impacting more populations. So years ago, we had really high outbreaks of these. We were really encouraged, but we've had drier falls since then. And so these fungi, because they are soil dwelling fungus, do need really humid conditions. And while we have very humid conditions in New Jersey, we're not really seeing really high populations of this yet. Next slide. Okay, so we're wrapping things up here, and I just wanted you to know that some of the key information here is that spotted lanternfly causes a homeowner nuisance. The impact of scraping egg masses and swatting adults is unknown. They do have 1 generation per year, and our greatest risk is for grapes and landscape ornamentals. Rutgers is doing a whole host of research on it, including some fun stuff we did last week where we fluorescently marked a bunch of bugs and watched where they went in a vineyard. So it's a fun nighttime activity to watch the glowing bugs go. And I think that's it. If you want to see if there's one more slide, I think it's just the, yep. I put this slide in here, state vehicle, to kind of emphasize this bug was killed before I left. That they are really good hitchhikers. So if you're in an area where spotted lanternfly is, make sure you're inspecting your vehicle before you move around. So that's all I have. And I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, but we kind of had some issues in the beginning.
Oh yeah, never heard.
Dogs being trained to sniff out egg masses for commercial hire. I don't know. We've done that with bed bugs and we've done that with stink bug. I don't know the status of that for spotted lanternfly, but that's a really good question.
Yeah, any other questions for Anne? Go ahead and put them in the chat box. Nancy said, thank you so much for the information. Great presentation. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, so that was amazing. I learned a lot because again, my knowledge was sort of fuzzy. I knew that they were starting to come into New Jersey and impacted plants, but not sure to what extent. What's that?
I said they're here by the thousands.
I know. Oh man, but sounds like you guys are doing a lot of great work to help better understand this new critter and help manage it. So thank you for all of the work that you're doing, and it's really important. So yeah, I'll just give another few seconds for anyone else that wants to put something in the chat box before we sign off for today. Let me see if there's anything else in the Q&A too.
It's really interesting working with this bug because it's under quarantine, so we're restricted in where we can work with it. We need the populations to work with it, which, we don't want to encourage populations because it's a bad pest. So the dog training was on TV, so that's cool.
That is cool.
That's probably more to do at airports, is usually where they've used that, the kind of beagles or the dogs for hire, at the airports to prevent more from coming in. But sometimes they rent them out too. They're fun to watch in the field.
And this probably goes with like emerald ash borer and maybe some other critters of like, for example, no moving of firewood from county to county. Would you recommend that's a good practice?
I would recommend that it's a practice that's been established for Asian longhorn beetle and emerald ash borer, and I would just stick to it. Yep.
Stick to it. Sounds good. All right. So if there's any other sightings, you can go again to slanternfly at njaes.rutgers.edu if you see anything where you live. Is there a website or somewhere they can go if they also want to reference other spotted lanternfly information? I think there's some information on Rutgers.
Yeah, Rutgers has some. We're still building our work. Most of it, there's not really only one or two fact sheets up there right now. And Penn State has a lot of information. Penn State was able to get a lot of grants early on for extension and public education. So they've really just been able to do some exceptional work with this.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much again, Anne. And if you guys have any other questions about tonight's program or any other upcoming programs, there's my email. Feel free to reach out. Thank you again, Anne, for hanging in there with the tech troubles in the beginning. We appreciate it.
Buddy.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you hopefully at the next talk. Keep an eye out for those upcoming programs for October too. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Anne, and take care, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Bye-bye.